Funding for Firing Line is made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Annenberg Foundation, the Laurel Foundation, L. John Polite, Jr., and the Friends of Firing Line.
From Columbia, South Carolina, welcome to Firing Line. I'm Michael Kinsley of the New Republic magazine. Being a college president seems like it ought to be an idyllic experience. A big brick house perched on a hill in the middle of some leafy campus. A permanent yet changing audience of earnest and adoring students for your philosophical views, your moral lectures, your little jokes. Power over the careers of your academic colleagues and rivals. The respect of the wider world, perhaps a few honorary degrees, maybe even an invitation to the White House. What could be nicer? Mr. Buckley's guests today, all college presidents, can testify that the job looks different from close up. Maybe they will even show a few of their battle scars. The trouble facing college presidents falls in three general categories: money, curriculum, and politics. The president of Stanford, Donald Kennedy, recently resigned under a cloud over improper billing of federal government for research costs, a scandal that embroiled many of America's big research universities. All of America's universities are struggling with costs and tuition increases that outpace inflation. Regarding curriculum, two trends conflict. One is the movement toward so-called core curriculums, emphasizing the classic tests of Western civilization. The other is multiculturalism, the move to reflect the diversity of today's student body in what those students are taught. Politically, there is the war over so-called political correctness, the charge of a new left-wing intolerance of dissenting views on campus. John Palms became president of the University of South Carolina here in Columbia this past March. He's graduated from the Citadel, has served in the United States Air Force, and holds a doctorate in physics. Leon Botstein has been president of Bard College in Annandale-on-Hudson, New York since 1975, and was president of Franconia College in New Hampshire for 5 years before that, meaning he's been a college president since the age of 24. John Silber, president of Boston University, is probably the most controversial college president in the country. He came close to losing that distinction when he barely missed becoming governor of Massachusetts as a Democrat last November. Mr. Buckley, you've persecuted any number of college presidents in your day, but what makes for a good one in your view?
Yeah, they are my favorite pincushions, I've often wondered, and I think that it would be useful to ask Mr. Silber about it. How much authority ought a university president to have? I remember asking President Schmidt of Yale what his authority was. He said, I have just one right, and that is to name the deans. I have absolutely no other authority. Is that true in BU?
No, I don't think that's true, and I don't even think that's true at Yale. I think the college president has about as much authority as he has the capacity to assert and to sustain. I think it has been very important for me to continue to publish and occasionally to teach since I came to Boston University in order to be able to establish a position relative to the faculty. If the faculty know that the president of the university can read and write, that helps in his ability to say why he
Does that frequently happen?
I think that happens far more rarely than people suppose. I think most college presidents assiduously avoid any intellectual argument with their faculty because I don't believe they can sustain that encounter. And as a result, they have very little to say with regard to tenure. The most important responsibility I think a college president has is to review every tenure case to be sure that no appointment is made unless the person who is the candidate fulfills the highest standards that they want for that university.
Well, you have the authority to veto a tenure appointment, but the president of Yale does not if the faculty authorizes it. Is that a critical authority in your view?
Well, has he asked the Board of Overseers at Yale for that authority?
The Harvard president has the authority to deny appointments.
Yes. And do you?
Yes.
And do you, Ms. Palm?
I do, but it's subject to review. There's always an opportunity for appeal to the trustees beyond the president.
I think that's true in all
that's true in all cases.
Are you all agree that this is a critical, perquisite would be the wrong word, a critical authority.
Quality faculty. The presumption is that to be a college president, you have to exert some leadership in the intellectual quality of the place. The trouble is that most search committees don't want individuals' leadership. We can't get the kind of leadership we ask for. And the paces that most search committees put college president candidates through allows the claim made by one of John Silber's colleagues, the Kant scholar Robert Paul Wolff, once said that anybody who wants to be a college president is by definition disqualified. That is to say, you have to give away most of your claims to intellectual authority to assure the alumni, the faculty, the politicians, that you're not going to do anything of any significance.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Palms, you arrived here at Columbia, South Carolina, in the wake of an unhappy experience with your predecessor, and I read only this morning an account of inflated numbers in the university, and the implication was that the administration was anxious to increase the number of students because it meant more revenue, with the result that you were taking people in who couldn't reasonably be expected to meet the standards you wanted to set. Is this something that is correctly stated?
Well, in this state, and so many states, in order to satisfy most everybody involved in higher education, the political system has instituted a formula for supporting public higher education. The formula is based on head counts of students you have and on square footage you use in that educational enterprise. So I think it's natural then, in order to get more revenues,
the expansionist,
to be sure you have an adequate supply of students. So there's always that danger of that accusation.
Well, was this one of the casi belli in your situation, Ms. Silber? When you took over, you faced a series of quarrels with some members of the faculty, with some members of the students, with some trustees. Was one of the questions whether you should continue to admit as many students as you were admitting over against increasing the quality of the average student?
No, when I came to Boston University in 1971, in January, there was already the beginning of a saturation in higher education. There were plenty of institutions to accommodate all the needs, and as a consequence, the number of...
The baby boomers were just coming in, weren't they, in 71?
The expansion had been so heavy that was the time at which Parsons College went out of business because it had lowered the academic standards and was making money off providing the degree for people who couldn't get in anywhere else. Now they were able to get in many other places, and it went out of business. And that was just about the time I came in. So our enrollment was on a decline, and at the same time, I insisted that we increase standards, and we allowed that enrollment to fall. That was a very unpopular thing to do, but I pointed out that we could not compete in price because we didn't have the endowment to subsidize a cost the way that Harvard would, and we had no state subsidies like a state university, so we had to compete in quality. And I introduced a program in which we reevaluated the faculty, tried to terminate those who were not up to standard, and had a massive program of recruitment of outstanding faculty at the same time that we were cutting back on many programs. Now, that inevitably created controversy on the faculty. There was no way to avoid it. The remarkable thing was that having brought the budget of the university into balance from about a 13% deficit within only 1 year, and having maintained a surplus ever since, I had the confidence of the Board of Trustees, so they stood with me when that controversy with the faculty came to a head in 1976.
Well, now, do you give out, for instance, tenure more sparingly than President Palms would need to do? Well, is there a difference in the number of tenured faculty in a private university over against a public university?
Well, I think that we have a relatively low tenure rate, and there are divisions of the university in which we simply have stopped giving tenure. For example, I don't think we should give tenure to any division of the university in which people can earn their living as professionals on the outside. So we no longer give tenure in the medical school or in the dental school, and I'm hoping that we're going to put an end to tenure in the school for the arts. We haven't yet, but we're moving in that direction. We're doing it decreasingly, and I don't think that we need tenure in schools of journalism or public relations. These are areas in which...
Where are bad journalists going to go?
What's that?
Where a bad journalist going to go?
Well, there should be plenty of room for them in the newspapers from what I've been reading there.
Is it to say,
I think one of the problems of having been in both the private university and 2 public institutions, all of us have used increased enrollments to fund our expanding programs.
Yeah.
And that expansion is just coming to an end, and that's created great tensions because a major source of revenue has been the increased number of students. When I was in the private institution of one of the new programs, the president would ask me, and when I was dean, you're going to have more students to do that. You can have that revenue. So I've increased the enrollment at Emory at that time. And in the state, the same
What is
thing.
your position about the open admissions? Do you believe that there ought to be a college in every state which is required to matriculate every student who graduated from high school?
No, I don't believe in that. Certainly not in the university level of institutions. Unfortunately, we don't complete the education that we're supposed to complete in high school, so many colleges are in the process of completing that higher educational process, and I think in that extent they ought to have some opportunity to do that, especially with our workforce skill requirement changing. We have to provide an opportunity for people to get the knowledge skills to be viable in this changing economy.
Well, is there a SAT limit beneath which someone is disqualified from matriculating at the University of South Carolina?
Not strictly on the SAT basis. It's always a complete analysis of the person's performance in high school, counsel's recommendations, the kind of courses they've taken, and it's a judgment. I would never want to just have a cutoff altogether.
Would that be true at board?
No, we don't. The SAT, I think, is a red herring, but I think the SAT does not really provide an adequate judge of a student's possibility as a student. I think it's a silly test. Basically, any multiple choice test by definition is counterintuitive. Life or intellectual work is not about choosing options.
Well, it tells you a certain amount. You say, was the Civil War in the 8th century, 10th century,
Yes,
18th century,
Mr. Buckley, but it doesn't allow even for approximation. In other words, we think someone is very educated if they get the Trojan War within 300 years. But you would mark wrong somebody who was off by a few years in more recent history. That is to say, it's not a useful test. If someone, for example, says, who was president when Pearl Harbor was bombed? Mm-hmm. And the 4 choices are Harry Truman, Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr., Franklin Roosevelt, and George Washington. Or Woodrow Wilson. Now, each of those answers, there's a right answer. But there is, in teaching
as
someone...
long as it was a Democrat.
Yes, always a Democrat, right. But there's also the fact that if someone says Harry Truman or Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr. has some fraction of knowledge which then needs to be, if in an essay situation, I believe in a test you ask someone a question, and that the so-called objective grading issue is a red herring. What the most important indicator of future college performance is high school performance, in my judgment. That is to say, especially for minorities and so-called disadvantaged populations, it's how well you do in the competitive context in which you grow up. Even if you come from a bad high school, if you do very well in a bad high school, you have a much better chance of doing well as you change the level of demand because you have essentially risen, you have the ambition to rise to the top. So in a way, the high school record, I think, the consistency, past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior.
But is it possible to spend the time necessary to make evaluations of that intensity?
But you see, I think it's to overlook a very useful aspect of the SAT. For example, while I would not take seriously a disastrously low performance on an SAT, depending upon circumstances, a high SAT is very difficult to fake. There's somebody who comes in with a 1300 on an SAT and has an average score in high school that never get into college on the basis of the average score. But what I would suspect when I saw that combination is a kid who was alienated or who had problems with the family or problems with the teachers. This would be a kid to bet on because there'd be ambition and talent there. They had to pick up a lot of words in order to be able to score an 800 or a 700 on the English part of the SAT.
I still would say, I think we would both agree to beware of the world which is littered with so-called highly tested underachievers. In other words, one of the problems with people who test very well, and the American mania for testing, is the sort of the romance of being the yet-to-be productive genius. So as the older I get, the more I'm interested in the hard work and less in the underexploited.
But everybody takes care of the hardworking, talented drudge. They are always respected. And
I'm not in favor of the drudge, but
we've done such a good job in analyzing the SAT. If a student can take an SAT and make a 750, pay $600 for a couple of courses and raise it to $950. That's what we've done. Now, certainly in the sciences and mathematics, we know almost about every kind of problem that's going to be on those SATs. People spend years preparing themselves for it. It's not really a good indicator of intelligence.
But your question is an important one. Should there be an opportunity for people who, let's say, do not test well or do not do well in high school to continue their education after high school? And I think there should be. But at the same time, it seems to me that one of the advantages of a very mixed system in the United States is that you need to have different kinds of institutions. And one very important issue, too, is that in the very selective institutions, one often creates a very artificial climate. Very gifted people are brought together in one place, create them their own context of who's good and who's not good. And a lot of people who go to very highly selective institutions end up thinking they're not as gifted as they really are because they've been in a skewed population. So having a very diverse population, even of ability and interest in an institution of higher education, is in fact a good thing. So we often confuse selectivity with the quality of an institution. Because an institution rejects 90% of its applications, it must be good. Well, it's so simply hard to get into. It doesn't mean it's a good place to go to school.
No, I agree.
Enrollment has also changed so much in an institution like the University of South Carolina system with almost 16,000 students that are non-traditional. The SAT is wonderful for a 17-year-old and an 18-year-old. It's not very predictable for a 26, 27, 28-year-old. There are other factors then you take into consideration.
So that you would weigh those other factors more strenuously if it was a 28-year-old wanting to matriculate.
Absolutely.
But even for an 18-year-old, I've discovered that motivation, love of learning, so hard to find, real enthusiasm, passion, curiosity, outweighs all the other measures.
That's right, but one of the jobs of a university and of a college is to create that enthusiasm.
Right. Absolutely.
Now, I think the answer to your question is yes, indeed. Every youngster who graduates from college ought to have the opportunity for a higher education, but that doesn't mean they're qualified. The critical thing
graduates from high school.
Yes, a graduate from high school. That no person who graduates from high school should be given college credit for any course that is taught below a level appropriate to college.
Right.
Now, these open admission programs, I think, are fine, provided they just give no college credit until the students have achieved that level so that they're capable of being transferred from a remedial program into a standard program.
Even if it means 6 or 7 years of college.
Yes, if it means 6 or 7 years, they simply weren't qualified.
Yeah.
One has to simply be ineducable to require 6 or 7 years in order to get through.
Well, to what extent, and this impinges on a recent Supreme Court decision, to what extent do you think that America tends institutionally to overemphasize a college degree? Some people feel that they have to have a college degree, otherwise they don't qualify for civil service jobs.
I think this is dreadful because there's so many people like Thomas Edison who had no interest in a higher education. He was working with his mind and his hands. There are very talented people who are not intellectuals. And one of the reasons why we had all the trouble with students in the late 60s in universities is because in order to avoid the draft, many people who had no interest in higher education loaded up the colleges, and then they demanded pass-fail courses. They demanded a drop of the foreign language exam on the PhD because these people did lack the intellectual interests that were appropriate to that kind of education.
Why did the faculty give in? Was this a raison d'éclair situation?
Well, and I think it was intimidation, too.
Well, since it's, I don't...
Why? This is very important because Van Woodward has written about this. You had a default on the part of the high clerical class in giving in to these demands. I wonder why it happened. Why did the overseers and the faculty and the administrations say, you win with these disruptive anti-intellectual demands?
Well, in some places they didn't, but I think they listened to some bad arguments. The argument was that these grades deny some minority students the opportunity to come through with a reasonable degree, whereas, as a matter of fact, by going to pass-fail, it denied any minority student the chance to so excel that his ticket would be written for the future. It allowed the middle class to protect themselves from downward mobility.
Yeah, yeah, but that doesn't account In other words, you're making an argument for the correct position, which you usually do. But what you haven't done is to account for the capitulation by so many people, for instance, at Cornell, at Harvard, as distinguished from Chicago.
There are also strong arguments, though, about the realization that there was a great diversity of talents in this society. I remember going to school, and they gave me a roommate who had flunked physics for the 4th time.
At Citadel?
Yeah, to help me get this person through physics. The person just had no interest in physics, could not do physics.
You were supposed to get osmotically from
That's
you?
right. And we decided that, people do have different talents, and they need to be directed in certain areas, and to give a prescribed core curriculum to everyone was perhaps unfair. And so there was some of that really rational argumentation, and I think I justified that. But there's certainly a core of information that we were agreeing on, but there are a lot of options within that core today.
Did your roommate pass?
Yeah, he passed.
we won't ask how, but but if we can skirt the historical issue for a moment. The question you asked me is everybody should overrating college. Well, there are 2 reasons to justify college on a broad scale. Number one is a simple question of what kind of education is the minimum requirement for a functioning democracy, which is something we're concerned about. And clearly, high school doesn't provide it in a world in which not
in this country.
Not in this country.
They do in Germany, they do in France,
yeah, but what
and
percent,
they do in England.
Only what percent graduate academic high schools in those countries? That is to say, a very small percentage. If we look at the United States, where we try to have a single system, essentially, where people graduate a essentially uniform system of high school, although it's very different in every state, the fact is that what we do in high school, so long as we don't improve high school, college has to be an option, because one has the ambition that a certain level of literacy, which we barely attain in college, I would say, is sufficient to really handle the difficult questions in a functioning democracy, so we don't give it up to the bureaucracy and to some people who really we don't, where it's a myth that we have some power. The second reason is economic.
It's one thing to say...
Common citizen can't exist in it, really.
It's one thing to say there must be access to such institutions.
Right.
It's another to say that in order to qualify as a merchandisable citizen, you got to have that degree.
Yeah, but the Ivy Leagues are the worst offenders in this. It's the toughest thing in the Ivy League is to get in, not to get out. In other words, I do think that America has gone sort of overboard in being obsessed about how one gets into college, and we would be much better off worrying about the standards of exit as opposed to the standards of entrance.
Well, if it's hard to get in, it's because it has been pre-established that having got in, you are very unlikely to flunk. There are variations on that theme. If you get accepted to Yale Law School, you're going to end up being a lawyer unless you decide to become an engineer. If you go to the Harvard Law School, you're going to have a 30% dropout rate.
But if we stick to college, which is, that's a professional school argument, but in college one could argue that once you're admitted, there's a premium on getting you out, in other words, having you graduate. But I think the question is that people should have the access, but the standards of exit, I would say the standards of college exit requirements should be raised.
Well, what percentage of BU freshmen graduate?
Well, graduate at Boston University or graduate someplace else?
Interesting question.
Yeah, because
take one at a time.
Well, we don't know the answer to the second question, and for that reason, I think the question of dropout is incomplete. But about 75%
graduate from BU.
Graduate from BU. Now, they don't graduate from BU in 4 years. That's another thing.
Now, are the other 25% kicked out, or do they choose to move?
No, I would say probably in terms of termination, it's probably around 15%.
15 of 25 or 15 of 100?
No, 15 out of 100.
I see.
But if you're talking about the reason for dropping out, I would say financial reasons at Boston University are among the highest reasons for dropout, because our tuition is high, our endowment is not large enough to provide the kind of subsidy for the cost of tuition, for the tuition price, that you would have in a more heavily endowed institution. And unlike a state institution, our tuition price is not subsidized by the taxpayer. So that creates a pressure. But academically speaking, I would not think more than 10 to 15%.
Excuse me, I have to cut you off there at that point, President Silber. Mr. Buckley, we do have a system in this country, more or less willy-nilly, where any high school graduate, or just about any high school graduate, can go to college. And that's rare, I think, among other developed countries. Now, partly this has been achieved...
It's not only rare, it's unique.
Right. Yeah. Now, this was achieved, perhaps you might say, by a farcical lowering of standards for high school graduation. But what about the ideal? In an ideal American society, should anyone who graduates from high school with proper standards be able, both in terms of room and in terms of finances, to go to college if they wish?
Well, I think the answer is ideally yes, but we don't deal in ideal situations. If in a hypothetically ideal world there would be no tuition to pay, you'd simply float through free. But given the fact that the average college graduate is going to end up earning more money than the average taxpayer whose taxes send him there, there's a matter of equity that has also to be weighed. And this, I think, is insufficiently stressed when people talk glibly about how everybody ought to be financed through college.
But the economic productivity of the college graduate presumably should be higher, particularly in an area where science and technology are at such a premium. It's unreasonable to expect that what is taught in high school is sufficient to create the productive power.
But that's a circular argument to the extent that you give advantages to a college graduate simply because he's a college graduate. And fail to acknowledge equivalent skills by somebody who happens not to be a college graduate.
I'm not suggesting that that kind of inequity exists. However, I'm suggesting that it's not a waste of taxpayers' money to support higher education.
I was just visited by a rector yesterday from a German institution where there is open admissions and absolutely no tuition. And Germany's still producing quality higher education.
Thank you very much, Professor Botstein, and Dr. Silber, and Dr. Palm, and Michael Kinsley, ladies and gentlemen.
Funding for Firing Line was made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support was provided by the Annenberg Foundation, the Laurel Foundation, L. John